Valeria stood beside the throne, not in the iron chains she had worn for weeks, but in midnight, blue silks that shimmered like a starless sky. The Alpha King Kael was at her side, a formidable presence of muscle and shadow, his hand resting possessively on the curve of her waist. His touch was a brand, a claim. Across the stone hall, an enemy lord, his face a mask of contempt, snarled, "You cannot trust a traitor." Valeria did not flinch. She met his furious gaze, and her voice, honed by weeks of cold and defiance, was like the edge of a blade. "The only traitor here," she said, her words echoing in the sudden silence, "is the one who fears a queen." She was the prisoner he swore to break, the woman whose name was a curse on his lips. He never expected her to become the one who would save his kingdom and shatter his world. But how did a condemned traitor rise to command the heart of the Alpha King? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story began where many stories end, in the deep, forgotten dungeons of the Duskfall Citadel. The air was a thick, suffocating blanket woven from the smells of damp stone, creeping mildew, and the cloying scent of despair. It was a place designed to crush the spirit before the body gave out. Light was a miserly gift, offered as a single, taunting sliver from a high barred window far beyond reach. Cold was the dungeon's most intimate companion. It seeped through the thin rags she wore, sinking into her bones with a relentless chill, a stark and bitter contrast to the inferno of her inner wolf, which paced the cage of her ribs with a silent, impotent fury. Her wrists were rubbed raw, the skin broken and bleeding from the heavy iron chains that bound her to the wall. They were forged with wolfsbane, a cruel metal that didn't just restrain her body but actively suppressed her shifting ability, leaving her feeling hollowed out, a vital part of her soul locked away in a dark, unreachable corner. Yet, Valeria refused to show weakness. To show it was to admit defeat, to validate the lies that had put her here. She focused on the slow, deliberate rhythm of her breath, anchoring herself to the rise and fall of her own chest. She fed the fire of her spirit with the injustice that burned there, a clean, hot rage that kept the encroaching despair at bay. In the darkness, she replayed the events of the ambush 1,000 times, her mind a relentless detective searching for a clue she might have missed. She sifted through the chaos, the screams of dying warriors, the clash of steel, desperately trying to recall the face of the true betrayer. She knew she was framed, her loyalty to the Duskfall Pack, the only family she had ever known, was absolute, forged in the harsh realities of an orphan's life, and tempered in the crucible of her service as a scout. Someone had sold them out, had led a dozen of the Alpha King's finest warriors into a slaughter, and had placed the blame squarely on her shoulders. The thought of it was a fresh wound, deeper and more painful than any physical injury. The groans and whimpers of the other prisoners, a constant, miserable chorus, died away abruptly. A heavy silence fell over the dungeon, a silence born of fear. Heavy, measured footsteps echoed from the stone corridor, each one a hammer blow against the quiet. The presence that accompanied them was a physical force, a wave of pure, undiluted power that washed over the cells, demanding submission. Alpha King Kael descended into his dungeons. When he stopped before her cell, The sliver of light from the window caught the hard lines of his face, carving him from the shadows. He was even more imposing up close than he was on the dais of the throne room, a mountain of a man built for war and rule. His eyes, like chips of obsidian, held no warmth, no pity, only the cold, hard glint of a king passing judgment. "Valeria Cross," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. "The whispers of your treachery have reached every corner of this kingdom. You led my warriors into a slaughter." Valeria lifted her head, her neck stiff from the cold and the weight of her chains. She met his gaze without flinching, her own eyes, the color of a stormy sky, holding a defiant spark. "I led them where your orders dictated, Your Majesty," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the tremor she felt in her heart. "Someone else sprung the trap, a muscle feathered in Kael's jaw, and I am to believe you, a low-born scout with no name, over my most trusted advisor, Lord Vorlag." He had expected a broken, pleading woman. He had come to see the traitor who had cost him men he considered brothers, to look upon her misery and find some satisfaction, some justice in it. Instead, he found unyielding pride, a spirit as untamed as the wild lands she patrolled. And as he looked at her, something else stirred within him, something primal and infuriating. His wolf, the beast of instinct and power that sat at the core of his being, rose not with the aggression he expected, but with a strange, possessive recognition. It was a pull, a magnetic draw to the woman in chains that angered him on a cellular level. He was the Alpha King. She was a traitor. This feeling was a betrayal of his grief, of his duty, and he was not the only one who felt it. Valeria's breath hitched beneath the layers of her own fury and fear. Her wolf, the part of her that knew pack and rank and power, answered his. It was a shocking, silent call to the very Alpha who had imprisoned her, a betrayal by her own deepest instincts that made her feel sick with confusion. The memory of the betrayal was a shard of glass in her mind, sharp and clear. It flashed behind her eyes. Unbidden, she was on patrol, moving through the dense, misty forests that bordered the lands of the Blood Moon Raiders. A dozen of Kael's elite warriors, the Iron Fangs, moved with her, their steps silent, their senses on high alert. They were following a route approved by Kael himself, a route based on intelligence provided by Lord Vorlag, who had claimed a Blood Moon raiding party was planning to strike a border village. The route was supposed to be safe, a way to circle behind the raiders and ambush them first. The air was still, too still. Valeria had felt it then, a prickle of unease on her skin. Suddenly, the world had exploded. Rival pack warriors, their faces painted with the snarling blood moon of their clan, swarmed them from all sides. It was a perfectly executed trap. There was no escape. Valeria fought with the vicious skill of a cornered wolf, her blades a blur of silver in the gloom. But they were overwhelmed, outnumbered 3-1. In the swirling chaos of the fight, as one of her comrades fell, she saw it. She saw a warrior named Tyrell, a man known for his unwavering loyalty to Lord Vorlag, make a subtle hand signal to the enemy commander just before a blood moon axe struck him in the shoulder, a blow that looked devastating but was clearly meant to wound, not kill. It was the proof, the undeniable truth of her innocence. But before she could shout a warning, before she could act on the sickening revelation. A heavy blow from behind sent her world spiraling into blackness. Kael slammed the heavy iron door of the cell shut, the sound a final, resounding clang of judgment. He ascended the winding stone stairs, leaving the cold and the despair of the dungeons behind him. He returned to his solar, a chamber of rich woods, worn leather, and the comforting scent of burning oak from the massive fireplace. Maps of the kingdom were spread across a large table, and reports from his captains lay in neat piles, demanding his attention. But he could not focus. He could not banish the image of the woman from his mind. Valeria's defiant face, her eyes like a gathering storm, floated before him. The scent of her, which he had caught even through the stench of the dungeon, a wild, clean fragrance of rain, soaked earth and crushed wild herbs, clung to him, haunting his senses. He was furious. Furious at her for her crime, for the unyielding pride that denied him the satisfaction of her submission. But he was more furious with himself, with his own inexplicable reaction. He should times hate her. She was responsible for the deaths of 12 good men, warriors he had trained with, bled with, and considered brothers. The grief was a raw, open wound in his chest, yet his wolf, the primal core of his being, paid no heed to his grief or his logic. It paced restlessly within him, a great, powerful beast agitated and unsettled. It demanded he return to the dungeon, to the cold stone cell, to the woman who was his prisoner. It was an instinct he could not explain, a pull he could not control, and it felt like madness. He stalked to the fireplace, staring into the dancing flames, their heat doing nothing to warm the chill of his conflict. He was the Alpha King, the ultimate authority, the protector of his pack. His duty was clear, to punish a traitor. But his own wolf, his very soul, was telling him she was something else entirely. Torn between his crown and an instinct he could not name, Kael felt the foundations of his world begin to crack. Sleep refused to come. Kael paced the length of his solar, the plush carpets doing nothing to soften the harsh, restless energy that coursed through him. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, yet he felt no chill. The conflict within him was a raging inferno. He was a king, a warrior, an alpha whose instincts had never once led him astray on the battlefield. Now, those same instincts were at war with his logic, his duty, and his grief. He found himself returning, again and again, to the image of Valeria in her cell, her stormy eyes meeting his, not with fear, but with a defiant fire that mirrored his own. It was madness. He told himself it was a weakness, a flaw in his judgment brought on by the loss of his men. Finally, unable to bear the confines of his own mind any longer, he moved with grim purpose. He strode from the room, his steps silent in the sleeping citadel. He justified the action with a cold internal logic. He needed to interrogate her further, to break her pride and wring a confession from her lips. That was all. He stopped by the kitchens, the cook on night duty bowing his head in silent deference. Kael grabbed a skin of fresh water and a thick piece of dark, crusty bread, telling himself it was merely a tool, a means to keep his prisoner alive and coherent for the questioning to come. He would not let her die of neglect before she faced his justice. When he reached the dungeons, the air hit him like a physical blow, thick and foul. He unlocked her cell door himself, the metal groaning in protest. Valeria was huddled against the far wall, a small, miserable shape in the gloom. She looked up as he entered, her eyes adjusting to the lantern he carried. He thrust the water skin and bread through the bars. "This is not a kindness," he growled, his voice harsher than he intended. "You are no use to me, dead." She said nothing, merely watching him with that unnerving stillness. She took the offerings, her movements slow and deliberate. She drank deeply from the water skin before tearing off a small piece of the bread, chewing it with a painful slowness that spoke of days of hunger. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. "Confess your treason, Valeria," he commanded, breaking the quiet. "Tell me who you sold my men to, and I will make your end swift." She swallowed, her throat working. When she spoke, her voice was a low, rough rasp, but it was steady. "I have nothing to confess, Your Majesty, but I do have questions." He scoffed, but she continued, her gaze unwavering. "Why would the Blood Moon Raiders know our exact patrol route? A route only 3 people knew. You, me, and the man who provided the intelligence, Lord Vorlag." The question hung in the air, sharp and logical. It was the same question that had been tormenting him, the one he had been pushing away. "Vorlag has served this pack for decades." He shot back, his anger flaring. "His loyalty is proven. Yours is not." "Is it?" she whispered, and the simple question was more effective than any shout. Or has he just had decades to hide his ambition? Kael stared at her, his fury warring with the cold, hard logic of her words. He found himself admiring her sharp mind, the strategic way she dismantled his accusations, even as it infuriated him. His gaze fell to her face, and for the first time, he truly saw the dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheekbone, the raw, chafed skin of her wrists, where the iron chains bit into her flesh. A sudden, protective rage surged through him, so powerful it stole his breath. It was a rage directed not at her, but at her suffering, at the chains, at the very cell she occupied. He suppressed it instantly, disgusted with himself. He was the one who had put her here. He turned on his heel, leaving the cell without another word, the echo of her quiet question chasing him up the stairs. The next day, Kael presided over a meeting of his council. The air in the high, vaulted chamber was heavy with grief and a simmering anger. Lord Vorlag stood near the head of the great oak table, his expression one of solemn sorrow, but his eyes held a sharp, calculating light. He was a handsome, charismatic wolf in his later years, his silvering hair lending him an air of wisdom and authority that he wielded with practiced ease. He had been Kael's father's friend, Kael's own mentor, and his voice carried immense weight in the court. "The pack bleeds, my king," Vorlag began, his voice resonating with carefully modulated grief. "Our warriors cry out for justice from their graves. The people are afraid. They see a traitor in our midst and wonder who else cannot be trusted." He let his words sink in, expertly playing on the fears of the other council members. "The traitor must be made an example of. A public execution will quell the unrest and show the Blood Moon Raiders we are not weak. It will cauterize this wound before it becomes infected." A murmur of agreement went through the council. They were good men, but they were grieving and afraid, and Vorlag's words offered them a simple, clean solution. Kael listened, his face a mask of stone. He looked at Vorlag, at the man who had taught him strategy, who had helped him become the Alpha he was today, and felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his gut. Valeria's question echoed in his mind. Asterisk. A route only 3 people knew. Asterisk. Her fate will be decided when I have all the facts, Kael said, his voice flat and non-committal. The words dropped into the charged atmosphere with the weight of a thrown gauntlet. Vorlag's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. What more facts are needed? She was the only survivor. She led them into a death trap, and that is what I find so convenient, Kael replied, his obsidian gaze sweeping over the council. The investigation is not over. He slammed his palm on the table, a sharp crack of authority that silenced all argument. We will speak of this no more today. The dismissal was absolute. Vorlag bowed his head in submission, but Kael saw the flicker of frustration, of thwarted ambition, in his eyes before it was masked once more by a veneer of loyal concern. The battle lines were being drawn, not just with the Blood Moon Raiders, but within the very walls of his own citadel. The nightly visits became a strange, unspoken ritual. The pretense of interrogation slowly eroded, leaving behind something raw and far more dangerous. Kael told himself he was gathering intelligence, studying the mind of a traitor, but he knew it was a lie. He was drawn to her, to the quiet strength that emanated from her, even in the depths of her captivity. He started bringing her better food from the royal kitchens. A piece of roasted meat, a small flask of wine. One night, finding her shivering uncontrollably on the stone floor, he returned with a thick wool blanket, tossing it into the cell with a gruff. The cold dulls the mind. I need you sharp. Their conversations drifted from the ambush to other things. They became a tense, cautious exchange of philosophies, of pack law, of personal histories. He learned that she was an orphan, raised by the pack but never truly belonging to any family. She had fought for everything she had, earning her place as a scout through sheer skill and determination, refusing the traditional path of a she-wolf, which was to be mated off to form an alliance. He found himself speaking of things he had told no one, of the crushing weight of the crown, of the loneliness that haunted the apex of power. One evening, he noticed a long, shallow cut on her forearm, festering in the dungeon's filth. On impulse, he entered the cell, ordering her to sit. He returned with a bowl of hot water and clean linen, and knelt before her. "Give me your arm," he commanded. She hesitated, her eyes wide with suspicion, but complied. As he gently cleaned the wound, his fingers brushed against her skin. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through both of them. He flinched, his gaze snapping to hers. He saw his own shock mirrored in her stormy eyes. The air crackled, suddenly intimate and heavy. The scent of her, wild herbs and clean earth, filled his senses. A heady perfume that calmed the restless beast within him. For Valeria, the nightly visits were a lifeline and a torment. She began to see the man behind the crown, the burdens he shouldered, the profound loneliness in his eyes. Her wolf, which should have hated him, which should have snarled at the sight of her captor, did the opposite. It felt a deep, resonant pull toward his power, toward his scent, a sense of home times that terrified her to her core. She knew these visits were her only weapon, her only chance to plant the seeds of doubt and prove her innocence. But as his thumb stroked the back of her hand in a moment of shared silence, she realized with a sickening lurch that the weapon was double, edged, and it was cutting her just as deeply as it was him. A new guard was assigned to her section of the dungeon, an old, grizzled warrior named Gregor, with a face like a worn leather map and kind eyes. He had been a friend of her father's, a scout in the old Alpha's guard. One night, as he passed her cell, he paused, glancing down the empty corridor before speaking, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Be careful, girl," he murmured, his gaze full of a sad pity. "I knew your father. He was a good man, loyal to the bone. You have his eyes." He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "Lord Vorlag's power has grown like a weed in the king's court since the old king passed. He was always jealous of your father's standing with the old Alpha. Always thought he should have been the one at the king's right hand." Valeria's heart hammered against her ribs. It was the first piece of external validation she'd had, the first voice besides her own that questioned the official story, and it provided a motive, a reason rooted in old jealousy and festering ambition. Vorlag hadn't just framed a random scout. He had framed the daughter of a man he once saw as a rival. It was a personal, petty vengeance, wrapped in a larger, more sinister plot. "Thank you, Gregor," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. He just gave her a single sad nod and moved on, leaving her with a renewed flicker of hope in the oppressive darkness. The commotion started as a distant shouting from the upper levels of the citadel, quickly escalating into the frantic ringing of an alarm bell. An attack, or a fire. Kael was in her cell, the two of them locked in another tense debate. When the sound reached them, instantly, his entire demeanor shifted. The thoughtful, conflicted man vanished, replaced by the pure, undiluted power of the Alpha King. His head snapped up, his body coiled like a spring, and a low, guttural growl escaped his lips, an involuntary sound of primal authority. His control, worn thin by weeks of inner turmoil, slipped for a breathtaking moment. His eyes bled from obsidian black to a molten, glowing gold. It was the raw power of his wolf, unleashed and ready for battle. Any other prisoner would have cowered, flattened themselves against the wall in submission. But Valeria was not any other prisoner. Her own wolf, chained and suppressed but never broken, rose to answer his call. She couldn't shift. The wolf's bane in her chains saw to that, but a responding growl rumbled deep in her chest, and her own eyes, for a fleeting second, flashed a brilliant, startling silver. It was an involuntary, primal acknowledgement. Alpha and subordinate, man and woman, a challenge and a submission all in one. The world seemed to fall away. The clang of the alarm bell, the shouts, the fear, it all faded into a dull background hum. There was only the silent, powerful communication between their wolves, a current of energy that arced between them, stunningly intimate and undeniable. Kael was shaken to his very core. It was more than just instinct, more than just a shared moment of aggression. It was proof. It was the tangible, visceral evidence of a connection, a bond of the soul that he had only ever read about in ancient legends, a thing whispered to be the ultimate source of an Alpha's strength. He stared at her, his golden eyes wide with shock and something akin to fear. The implications of it, of what she was to him, crashed down with the force of a tidal wave. Without another word, he turned and fled the cell, his heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. He was more conflicted, more lost than ever before. The morning after the alarm, the citadel was a hive of nervous energy. The attack had been a small, probing raid by a handful of Blood Moon warriors, easily repelled. But it had frayed the pack's already raw nerves. For Kael, however, the true battle had not been on the walls, but in the dungeon. The memory of Valeria's silver eyes flashing in response to his own golden gaze was burned into his mind. It was a brand on his soul. The bond was real. It was not a figment of his imagination or a trick of his grief-addled mind. It was a living, breathing thing that connected him to the woman in his dungeon, and the thought of her remaining in that filth, in that cold, dark place of despair, was suddenly physically unbearable. It was an affront to his wolf, an affront to the ancient magic that had chosen her. Before the sun had fully risen, he gave the order. It was delivered in a clipped, non-negotiable tone that left the guards scrambling. Valeria was to be moved. She heard the heavy footsteps approaching, the jangle of keys. But this time it was different. The cell door swung wide open, and the head guard, a man whose face was a permanent sneer, looked at her with a new, grudging respect. "On your feet, traitor. The king has found a new cage for you." Wary, her muscles stiff and sore, Valeria rose. They unlocked her chains, and the sudden freedom in her limbs was so strange it almost made her stumble. The wolfsbane had leached her strength, and her wrists were a mess of raw, bleeding flesh. Flanked by 2 guards, she was marched up countless flights of stairs, leaving the stench and the misery of the dungeons far below. They stopped before a heavy oak door at the top of an isolated tower, a place she had only ever seen from the training grounds below. One of the guards unlocked it and shoved her inside. "Don't get any ideas," he grunted. "The bars are as strong as your last ones, and it's a long way down." The door slammed shut, the bolt ramming home with a sound of finality. Valeria stood, blinking, in the center of the room. It was a gilded cage, sunlight, a true and glorious flood of it, poured through a large arched window. The window was barred, as the guard had promised, but through it, she could see the jagged peaks of the northern mountains, their tops crowned with snow. The room was furnished with a soft bed piled high with furs, a small table and chair, and even a shelf of books. A pitcher of water and a clean glass stood waiting for her. The air smelled of beeswax and dried lavender. After weeks in the dungeon, it was a sensory overload, a shock to her system. This wasn't freedom, she knew that. It was a different kind of prison, a more comfortable one, but a prison nonetheless. Yet, as she limped to the bed and sank into the impossibly soft mattress, a wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over her. The warmth, the clean clothes laid out for her, the quiet dignity of the space, they were a balm to her battered body and a lifeline to her flagging spirit. Here, she could think. Here, she could plan. Here, she could fight back. Kael's visits continued, but their nature had fundamentally changed. The thin pretense of interrogation was gone, stripped away by the raw, primal acknowledgement that had passed between their wolves. Now, when he came to her tower room, he came not as a king to a prisoner, but as a man drawn by a force he no longer tried to deny. He began to bring her meals himself, trays laden with food from his own table, a silent offering that spoke volumes more than words. They would sit for hours, sometimes in a comfortable silence, sometimes talking, the conversation weaving through the twilight hours. "Why did you join the Scouts?" he asked one evening, his voice a low rumble as he sat in the chair across from her, watching her eat. "It's a hard life for a she-wolf." Valeria paused, a piece of bread halfway to her lips. She met his gaze, her own clear and direct. "I wanted to serve the pack, not be married off to settle a land dispute," she said simply. "I wanted to earn my place, not have it given to me based on who my mate was. My loyalty, my worth, they are my own." He nodded slowly, a flicker of deep respect in his obsidian eyes. He understood that sentiment more than she knew. He found himself sharing things with her that he had never spoken of to his council, not even to Vorlag. He spoke of the immense pressure of being Alpha, the constant weight of 1,000 lives resting on his shoulders. He spoke of the loss of his parents in a border skirmish years ago, the sudden brutal thrust into a leadership role he had not been fully prepared for. He was drawn to her strength, to the keen intelligence that shone in her eyes, to the unbending core of honor that he now saw so clearly. The bond between them was a constant humming presence in the room, a low thrum of energy that both soothed and electrified him. He was beginning to doubt the treason charge not just on a gut instinct, but on the undeniable character of the woman before him, a woman who valued her own worth, who fought to earn her place, was not the kind of person to betray her pack for a handful of silver. With a clearer head and a body slowly healing from the rigors of the dungeon, Valeria began her own subtle investigation. She knew she could not openly accuse Vorlag, not without concrete proof. Kael's trust in his mentor was decades deep, and to challenge it directly would be to invite his wrath and disbelief. So she used their conversations, turning them into a tool, a delicate probe to strategically guide Kael toward the truth. She began to ask seemingly innocent questions about the inner workings of the pack, about logistics, trade routes, and the responsibilities of his council members. She was building a map of the pack's power structure in her mind, searching for the cracks where corruption could take root. One evening, as Kael spoke of the difficulties of maintaining the northern border, she saw her opening. "Lord Vorlag oversees the northern border trade, doesn't he?" she asked, her tone one of simple curiosity. "With the Blood Moon Raiders' territory just beyond, that must require delicate negotiations." Kael grunted in agreement. Delicate is one word for it. It requires a constant flow of coin to informants and go-betweens to keep the peace and the goods flowing. Vorlag has a knack for it. He handles it all. He must be a very trusted man, Valeria mused, letting her gaze drift to the window. To be given such autonomy with the pack's treasury, and with our most dangerous enemies. She let the sentence hang in the air, a seed planted in the fertile ground of his growing doubt. She did not need to say more. She was not accusing Vorlag of anything. She was merely holding up a mirror, forcing Kael to look at the situation from a new angle, to see the immense power and opportunity for treachery that he himself had placed in his advisor's hands. She was leading him to the connections, allowing him to feel as though he were discovering them himself, making it his truth, not her accusation. Her words worked on him like a slow, creeping poison. Kael found himself unable to dismiss the implications of what she had said. Vorlag's autonomy, the flow of coin, the proximity to the Blood Moon Raiders, it all coalesced with her earlier question about the patrol route. His suspicions, now fully aroused by Valeria's pointed but subtle questions, demanded action. He could no longer ignore the cold knot of dread in his stomach. The next day, citing a need to review the pack's expenditures for the coming year, he discreetly requested the records of the northern border trade, the very ledgers that Lord Vorlag managed with such meticulous care. He spent the entire afternoon locked in his solar, the heavy books spread across his table. At first, everything seemed to be in order. Vorlag was, as Kael had always known, fastidious. Every transaction was noted, every expenditure categorized. But Kael, his senses now sharpened by suspicion, looked deeper. He started Cross, referencing dates of payments with reports from his border patrols. He found discrepancies, small at first, but significant. There were payments made to informants on days when his patrols reported no contact with anyone. There were shipments of goods, furs, and iron ore traded to neutral clans that were recorded as being slightly smaller upon their return than when they were sent out. A few missing pelts here, a small ingot of iron there. Nothing that would raise an alarm on its own, but taken together, over months, it formed a trail of smoke, a faint but undeniable scent of deceit. It wasn't proof of treason, not yet, but it was a clear pattern of skimming, of quiet, methodical theft. It was a trail of lies. A cold, sickening dread formed in Kael's stomach. The thought that Vorlag, his father's closest friend, the man who had been a second father to him, could be a traitor was a physical blow. It felt like a betrayal of his entire life, of his own judgment. But the evidence, however circumstantial, combined with Valeria's cold logic and the undeniable soul, deep bond that hummed between them, was too much to ignore. The foundation of his world was not just cracked. It was beginning to crumble. That night, he came to Valeria's room late, long after the citadel had fallen silent. He didn't bring a food tray. He didn't speak. He simply entered, his broad shoulders slumped, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He looked weary, burdened, and for the first time since she had met him, vulnerable. He sank into the chair, running a hand over his face, the picture of a king cornered by a truth he did not want to face. The silence in the room was heavy, but it was a comfortable, shared weight. Valeria watched him, her heart aching with a strange mix of triumph and sympathy. She saw the profound conflict in his eyes, the war between his loyalty to his past and the evidence of the present. After a long moment, she rose from the bed. She walked over to him, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. She hesitated for only a heartbeat, a flicker of the old dynamic, the prisoner and the king. Before pushing it aside, she reached out and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. The touch was not challenging, nor was it seductive. It was a simple, profound gesture of comfort, of understanding. It was a role reversal so complete it was breathtaking. The prisoner was comforting her king. Kael went still, his breath catching in his chest. He slowly looked up at her, his obsidian eyes searching hers. In their stormy depths, he did not find accusation or satisfaction. He found strength, empathy, and an unwavering certainty that mirrored the bond connecting their souls. In that moment, the last of his resistance, the final wall he had built around his heart to deny what he felt for her, shattered into dust. He reached up, his large, calloused hand covering hers. his thumb stroking the back of her wrist. Their connection, born in suspicion, forged in conflict, and revealed in a flash of primal magic, was finally, consciously, acknowledged. The morning air that filtered through the barred window was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine from the high mountain forests. It was a scent of freedom, a scent that had once been the backdrop to Valeria's entire life, and now served as a constant, painful reminder of her gilded cage. Kael arrived with the dawn, not with the hesitant uncertainty of his previous visits, but with a grim, resolute purpose etched into the hard lines of his face. He carried no tray, offered no pretense. He stood before her, the Alpha King, his power a palpable force in the small room, and for the first time, he looked at her not as a puzzle to be solved or a temptation to be resisted, but as an equal. "You were right," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that held no room for argument. "I looked into Vorlag's trade records. There are inconsistencies, small thefts, laundered coin. It's not enough to prove treason, but it's a start." He met her gaze, his obsidian eyes holding the dark, turbulent emotions of a man whose world was tilting on its axis. "Tell me everything you suspect. Hold nothing back." Valeria felt no triumph, only a cold, steady resolve. She had his ear, and she would not waste the opportunity. She rose from the chair and began to pace, her mind finally clear and sharp, assembling the pieces of the conspiracy she had turned over and over in the darkness of the dungeon. "It began long before the ambush, Kael. It began with my father," she started, her voice even. "Gregor, one of the old guards, told me Vorlag was always jealous of my father's position at your father's side. When my parents died and I chose the path of a scout, I became a living reminder of that old rivalry, a thorn in his side." She laid out the theory with the precision of a scout mapping treacherous terrain. Vorlag, consumed by ambition, saw Kael's reign as his opportunity. He began siphoning funds, building a network of spies, and paid conspirators under the guise of managing northern trade. He used his position to secretly communicate with the Blood Moon Raiders, an enemy he was supposed to be containing. "The ambush wasn't just about killing your warriors," she explained, her eyes flashing with a cold fire. "It was about creating chaos, about making you look weak and indecisive, and I was the perfect scapegoat, a low-born orphan with no family to defend her name, the daughter of his old rival. Framing me was both practical and personal. He needed a catalyst for a wider conflict, a reason to push the pack toward a war that would bleed its resources and your authority, and he needed to remove a scout who spent more time in the northern territories than anyone, someone who might stumble upon his dealings with the Blood Moon clan." Kael listened, his face a grim mask of stone, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. Every word she spoke resonated with the ugly truth he had found in the ledgers. The pieces fit, forming a sickening picture of long, nurtured treachery. They were no longer king and prisoner. They were two wolves standing back to back, surrounded by unseen enemies. They were a team, forged in the crucible of betrayal. Their work began in secret, a silent conspiracy to unravel a larger one. Kael, using his absolute authority, began to quietly move men he knew were unswervingly loyal into key positions within the Citadel Guard and his personal retinue. It was a delicate chess game. moving his pieces without alerting his opponent that he was even aware of the board. His primary weapon, however, was no longer his alpha strength or his royal decree, but the sharp, strategic mind of the woman in the tower. Every night, he brought her copies of patrol reports, supply manifests, and diplomatic correspondence. He would watch, a silent, imposing figure, as she spread the scrolls across the small table, her brow furrowed in concentration, her scout's eye trained to see a broken twig or an unnatural silence in the forest, saw things in the dry reports that his entire council had missed for years. She had a keen, almost supernatural eye for patterns. She connected a supposedly failed harvest in a Western farming collective with a sudden, undocumented surplus of grain being sold at a border market 2 weeks later. She noted that every time a specific merchant made a trip into the neutral lands bordering the Blood Moon territory, a Duskfall patrol in a completely different sector would be hit by a minor, harassing raid, just enough to draw attention and resources away from the north. She was mapping the web of Vorlag's deceit, thread by invisible thread. "Here," she said one evening, her finger tapping a name on a trade manifest. "Lorcan. He's a fur trader. According to these records, he makes a trip to the Three Rivers crossing once a month. He's one of Vorlag's most profitable assets." She pulled another scroll towards her, and according to these patrol logs, his trips align perfectly with the dates of Vorlag's largest payments to his informants. He's the go-between, Kael. He's the one carrying messages to the Blood Moon Alpha. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, lifted to meet his. "You need to intercept him. Not here. Not in the Citadel where Vorlag's eyes are everywhere. Take him on the road, far from home. Make him talk." The suggestion was bold, dangerous. It was an act of open aggression against a man under Vorlag's protection. But Kael saw the cold, hard logic in it. It was time to stop looking for smoke and start searching for the fire. Vorlag was no fool. He had spent a lifetime navigating the treacherous currents of pack politics. He felt the shift in the Citadel's atmosphere like a change in the wind. Kael's questions in council meetings had become sharper, more probing. Guards loyal to Vorlag for years were suddenly reassigned to remote outposts, replaced by men whose loyalty was solely to the Alpha King, and the public execution he had been demanding had been indefinitely postponed. The source of this change was obvious. It was the she-wolf in the tower, the traitor who refused to break, who was somehow whispering poison into the king's ear. He couldn't risk what she might know, what she might guess. He had to silence her, permanently. That night, as a cold rain lashed against the tower window, Valeria slept. It was not the deep, restful sleep of the innocent, but the light, wary slumber of a wolf. Her instincts, honed by years of sleeping on the hard ground with one ear open for danger, screamed a warning. It was a prickle on her skin, a sudden chill in the air that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Her eyes snapped open. A floorboard in the corner of the room, near a tapestry depicting an ancient battle, had been silently lifted. A figure, cloaked in black from head to toe, rose from the opening like a wraith, a long, thin blade gleaming in the faint moonlight. A secret passage. There was no time to scream. The assassin moved with a fluid, terrifying silence, but Valeria was already rolling off the bed, her body reacting with pure instinct. She came up in a crouch, grabbing the heavy water pitcher from her bedside table. The assassin lunged, the blade slicing through the air where her throat had been a second before. She threw the pitcher with all her might. It caught the killer on the shoulder with a dull thud, staggering him for a precious instant. It was the only opening she would get. She was a scout, not a brawler. Her skills were in speed and evasion. She darted across the room, her mind racing. The room was a trap, with only one exit, and the assassin was between her and the door. A desperate, frantic fight for survival began. She used the furniture as her weapons, throwing a chair, upending the table to create a barrier. She was skilled, agile. But the assassin was a professional, relentless and deadly, forcing her back step by step, miles away. In his solar, Kael felt it. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a spike of pure, undiluted terror that shot through the bond connecting him to Valeria. It was her fear, her desperation, a silent scream that echoed directly in his soul. He was on his feet in an instant, his chair crashing to the floor. His wolf surged forward, a wave of uncontrollable alpha rage. He didn't use the stairs. He launched himself from the balcony of his solar, landing with a ground, shaking impact on the courtyard stones below, and sprinting toward her tower, his guards scrambling to keep up. He burst through the locked door of her room, splintering the thick oak as if it were kindling. He found her cornered, a bloody gash on her arm, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The assassin was closing in for the final kill. His blade raised. A roar of pure, possessive fury tore from Kael's throat. He was no longer a king. He was a primal force of nature. He crossed the room in a single, predatory blur. The assassin, shocked by his sudden appearance, had no time to react. Kael's hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist and shattering the bone with a sickening crack. The blade clattered to the floor. Before the killer could even scream, Kael's other hand closed around his throat, lifting him from his feet. There was a final, brutal snap, and the body went limp. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of their ragged breaths and the drumming of the rain against the window. The dead assassin lay in a crumpled heap on the floor. Kael stood over the body, his chest heaving, the golden light of his wolf slowly receding from his eyes, leaving behind the dark, turbulent pools of a man pushed to the brink. He turned to Valeria. She was leaning against the wall, trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion, but her eyes were wide and defiant. The gilded cage had become a trap, and the proof of the conspiracy was written in blood on her floor. All pretense, all restraint, and was gone. The sight of her, wounded and hunted in a prison he had put her in, filled him with a guilt so immense it was a physical pain. He had been so blind, so bound by duty and suspicion, that he had almost gotten her killed. He strode to her, his gaze burning with an intensity that stole her breath. He gently took her injured arm, his touch surprisingly tender as he examined the gash. "This ends now," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. It was rage and guilt, and something far more profound. "You are not safe here. You are not a prisoner anymore, Valeria." He looked up, his eyes locking with hers. "You are my ally." A wry, humorless smile touched her lips. "I have been your ally from the beginning, Kael," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "You are just now realizing it." The truth of her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had been the fool. He had been the one who was blind. He reached up, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking the sharp line of her cheek. The world narrowed to the space between them, to the undeniable pull that had tormented them both for weeks. He lowered his head, and his mouth crashed down on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, passionate claiming, a raw and hungry expression of every unspoken feeling that had passed between them. It was the sealing of their alliance, the forging of a new pact in the shadow of death. It was the beginning of everything. He pulled her from the tower room without another word, leaving the guards to deal with the body and the secret passage. He would not allow her to spend another moment in that vulnerable, isolated place. He took her to his own chambers, the sprawling suite of rooms at the very heart of the citadel, the center of his power. The guards posted outside his door, the most elite warriors in the pack, stared in stunned silence as their Alpha King swept past them with the former traitor in his arms, her blood staining the front of his tunic. He laid her gently on his own bed, a massive thing of carved oak and black furs, and immediately summoned his personal physician to tend to her wound. As the physician cleaned and stitched the gash on her arm, Valeria looked around the room. It was a space that spoke of pure, masculine power. Weapons hung on the walls. Maps were spread across a massive table, and the air smelled of leather, wood smoke, and kale. It was a world away from her tower, and a universe away from the dungeon. Here, she was not a prisoner. Here, she was at the king's side, a position of unimaginable intimacy and even greater danger. They both knew Vorlag would not stop. The failed assassination attempt would only make him more desperate. They needed definitive proof, something they could take before the council, before he decided to escalate his plans. As if summoned by their thoughts, a sharp knock came at the chamber door. One of Kael's most trusted captains entered, his face grim. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing low. "We have him. The merchant, Lorcan. He was intercepted on the road, just as you commanded." Kael's eyes narrowed. "And he was reluctant to talk at first," the captain said, a grim satisfaction in his tone, "but he became much more cooperative. He confessed everything." The captain handed Kael a rolled scroll, sealed with the captain's own ring. He confirmed he was the courier for Lord Vorlag. He carried messages to the Blood Moon Alpha for months. "We have the latest message. It was on his person when we took him." Kael broke the seal and unrolled the parchment. He read it, his face growing darker with every word. Valeria watched him, her heart pounding. When he was finished, he handed the scroll to her without a word. Her eyes scanned the neat, precise script. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the nail for Vorlag's coffin. The message was a detailed plan. Vorlag had promised the Blood Moon Alpha the fertile southern valleys, the breadbasket of the Duskfall pack, in exchange for their help in a full-scale, coordinated assault on the citadel itself. The attack was planned for 3 days' time, during the festival of the new moon, when the citadel's guard would be at its lowest state of readiness. The blood moons would storm the outer walls, creating a diversion, while Vorlag and his conspirators inside the keep would assassinate Kael and seize the throne. The full, horrifying scope of the treachery was laid bare. They had their proof. and they had a war to win. Life in the Alpha King's chambers was a strange paradox of intimacy and strategy. The sprawling suite, once the solitary domain of a lonely king, had transformed into a war room, a sanctuary, and a home. Valeria was no longer a prisoner, but Kael's hidden partner, the mind behind the throne. She had access to everything, his maps, his strategies, his innermost thoughts. The days were a blur of intense planning. Scrolls and charts spread across the massive oak table that had once been used for solitary meals. The nights were a quiet exploration of the bond that had drawn them together, a silent acknowledgement of the future they were fighting for. The dynamic between them was a delicate dance of power and trust. He was the Alpha, his presence a constant grounding force of raw strength, but he deferred to her intellect without hesitation. He would watch for hours as she moved around the map, her finger tracing enemy movements, her brow furrowed in concentration. She saw the Citadel's defenses not as a commander, but as a scout, as an infiltrator. She pointed out weaknesses no one had ever considered. A blind spot in a watchtower's rotation, a section of the wall where the stone was older and more easily scaled, a sewer grate that had been forgotten for a generation. Her brilliance was a constant source of awe for him. He found himself completely dependent on her counsel, respecting her mind as much as he desired her body. He started calling her his Shadow Queen, a title whispered in the quiet hours of the night, a name that acknowledged her hidden power, her role as the unseen force guiding his hand. For Valeria, it was a dizzying, terrifying, and exhilarating transformation. The constant threat of death still hung over them, but within the walls of Kael's chambers, she felt a sense of safety she hadn't known since childhood. She allowed herself to trust him, to lean on his strength, to see the man who carried the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. In his eyes, she saw not just a king, but a partner. She saw the future they could have, a future forged in fire and betrayal, but a future together, if only they could survive the coming storm. The chains of the dungeon felt like a lifetime ago, a nightmare from which she had finally awoken, with the full scope of Vorlag's treachery laid bare. Their planning became ruthlessly efficient. They had the what, the who, and the when. Now they needed the how. They used the captured merchant, Lorcan, broken and terrified in a secure cell, to set their counter trap. They fed him a new message to be sent back to Vorlag's network, a carefully crafted piece of disinformation designed to lull the traitor into a false sense of security. The message, written in Kael's own hand but composed by Valeria, confirmed that the king was distracted, consumed with the upcoming festival, and that the Citadel's guard would be reduced even more than planned. It was the bait. The core of the strategy was Valeria's brainchild, a brutal but brilliant plan she called the Anvil. "We can't just defend the walls, Kael," she explained, her finger tracing a path on the map of the Citadel. "We have to let them in. We have to let the Blood Moon Raiders breach the outer wall at a single specific point." She tapped a section of the western wall, a place known for being structurally sound, but which she knew had a hidden flaw. "We'll weaken it from the inside, make it look like an easy target. When they pour through, they won't find an open path to the keep. They'll find themselves funneled into this narrow courtyard." Her finger circled a tight enclosed space between the outer wall and the main barracks. Our archers will be on the rooftops. Our best warriors will be waiting. It will be a kill zone, an anvil, and your forces will be the hammer. We'll crush them there, away from the civilians. Kael stared at the map, his jaw tight. This is risky. It puts the entire citadel in danger. If we miscalculate, if they break through your anvil, a clean cut is better than a festering wound, Valeria countered, her voice firm, her stormy eyes meeting his without a flicker of doubt. Vorlag's corruption runs deep. We don't know how many of the guard are loyal to him. By letting the blood moons in, we force Vorlag and his conspirators inside the keep to make their move. They'll think your attention is on the wall, that you're trapped. They'll reveal themselves. We have to remove all the rot at once, Kael, or this pack will never truly heal. He saw the unbending logic in her words, the ruthless pragmatism that complemented his own protective power. She was right. This had to end. Completely and decisively. They could not fight this war alone. While Kael had his loyalists, Vorlag had spent years weaving his web of influence. They needed to be certain of every man they brought into their circle. It was Valeria, with her outsider's perspective and her keen judgment of character, who guided Kael's choices. She had spent her life on the fringes, observing the subtle shifts of power and allegiance within the pack. She knew which warriors were driven by honor and which were driven by ambition. Guided by her insights, Kael called a series of private, late. He summoned only a handful of pack members, warriors and elders whose loyalty he knew was to the pack itself, not to any one man. The first he called was Gregor, the old grizzled guard who had shown Valeria kindness in the dungeon. The old wolf's eyes widened when he was ushered into the king's private chambers to see Valeria standing there, not in chains, but at the king's side. Kael revealed a portion of Vorlag's treachery, showing them the merchant's confession and the intercepted message. He didn't tell them the full plan, just enough to secure their unwavering loyalty. Vorlag means to burn this pack to the ground and rule over the ashes. Kael told the small, grim-faced group. He will use the Blood Moon attack as a cover to strike at me and seize the throne. We will not let that happen. He gave them their secret orders, his voice low and commanding. Gregor, his face a mask of grim determination, was tasked with a vital role. On the day of the attack, he and a small team of trusted older guards were to quietly evacuate the civilians, the children and the elderly, into the secret passages beneath the keep, the very passages the assassin had used. Other captains were given orders to feign allegiance to Vorlag, to report back on his movements, to be Kael's eyes and ears among the conspirators. They were building their army within the army, preparing for a civil war as much as a siege. Each man left the chamber with a new, heavy weight on his shoulders, but with a fire of renewed purpose in his eyes. The night before the New Moon Festival was heavy with a tense, electric silence. The storm was coming. They had done all they could to prepare. Now, all that was left was to wait for the dawn. Kael and Valeria stood by the large arched window of his chamber, looking out over the sleeping citadel. The moon was a thin silver sliver in the inky black sky. Kael turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "I have something for you," he said, his voice a low murmur. He moved to a large carved chest at the foot of his bed and lifted the heavy lid. He pulled out a bundle of dark, oiled leather and gleaming steel. He laid it on the bed, and Valeria's breath caught in her throat. It was a suit of armor, custom, made to fit her perfectly. It was the armor of a scout, light and flexible, designed for speed and silence, but it was reinforced with dark, burnished steel plates across the chest, shoulders, and back. It was practical, deadly, and beautiful, but it was the mark on the breastplate that made her heart stop. It was not her old scout insignia, nor was it the snarling wolf of the Duskfall pack. It was a new symbol, one she had never seen before. A silver wolf's head, its eyes fierce and intelligent, was intricately intertwined with the golden stylized crown of the Alpha King. She reached out, her fingers tracing the cool, smooth metal of the insignia. It was them, her and him, the scout and the king, the prisoner and the Alpha, united, forged into one. "Tomorrow," Kael said, his voice thick with an emotion that resonated deep in her soul. "You will not stand behind me. You will not hide in the shadows." He stepped closer, his large, warm hands coming to rest on her shoulders. He looked down at her, his obsidian eyes burning with a fire that had nothing to do with battle and everything to do with her. "You will stand beside me as my queen." It was not a question. It was a declaration, a promise of a future made in the quiet intimacy of the night, a vow sealed in steel and shadow. Tears pricked at Valeria's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was done with tears. She looked from the armor to his face, to the king who had imprisoned her, who had tormented her, and who had ultimately come to trust her with his life and his kingdom. She lifted her chin, her gaze as steady and unyielding as his. "I will," she whispered. It was the only answer he needed. The weight of the armor was a comfort, a symbol of her impossible journey from iron chains to the very brink of a throne. Their last night of peace was spent not in planning or speaking of the battle to come, but in a quiet, profound intimacy that transcended words. The armor lay on the bed, a silent testament to the promise that had been made. They stood by the window for a long time, his arm wrapped securely around her, her head resting against his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her ear, a rhythm that was both a comfort and a call to arms. They had come so far, from a dark, hate-filled confrontation in a filthy dungeon, surrounded by the stench of despair, to this moment of quiet unity, surrounded by the trappings of royalty. They were two halves of a whole, their bond the unshakable foundation of everything they were about to do. He was the strength, she was the strategy. He was the hammer, she was the blade. Together, they were unstoppable. As the first faint hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, they knew their time was up, and as if on cue, a sound, faint at first, then growing louder, drifted on the dawn wind. It was the deep, mournful cry of a horn, a sound of hunger and war. The Blood Moon Raiders had come. The storm had broken. The horn's cry was a promise of blood. And the promise was kept. Chaos erupted along the western wall as the Blood Moon Raiders, fueled by the promise of easy victory and fertile lands, poured through the breach Valeria had prepared for them. From the high windows of the keep, it looked like a tide of savagery, a wave of painted faces and crude iron weapons crashing against the citadel's heart. But the chaos was an illusion. It was a carefully orchestrated symphony of death. As the raiders flooded into the narrow enclosed courtyard, their triumphant howls turned to screams of agony. A volley of arrows, thick as black rain, descended from the rooftops, each shaft finding its mark with lethal precision. The raiders at the front fell, tripping those behind them, creating a bottleneck of flesh and panic. Then, from the barracks doors on the far side of the courtyard, the hammer fell. Kael's elite warriors, the Iron Fangs, charged into the fray. Their disciplined fury a stark contrast to the raiders' wild desperation. The courtyard became an anvil, just as Valeria had planned. A brutal, efficient meat grinder where the Blood Moon's strength was being systematically annihilated. Inside the throne room, a different kind of battle was about to begin. Lord Vorlag stood before the great oak council table, his face a mask of grave concern. He had gathered the council for a supposed crisis meeting, his voice ringing with false urgency. "The king is distracted," he declared, his gaze sweeping over the assembled lords and elders, many of whom were his secret allies. His sentiment for a traitor has blinded him to the real threat. The Blood Moon raiders are at our door, and he has left the keep undefended. He pointed a dramatic finger toward the sounds of battle outside. He has doomed us all. His weakness will be the end of this pack. Vorlag drew himself up to his full height, his charisma a palpable force. "I, Lord Vorlag, invoke the ancient right of challenge. The pack is in mortal danger, and the Alpha has failed. I will take this pack. I will save it from his folly, and I will lead it to glory." On his signal, a dozen men in the room, men who had eaten at Kael's table and sworn him fealty, drew their hidden weapons. They moved to surround Kael, who stood near the throne, his expression unreadable. Vorlag smiled, a cold, triumphant gleam in his eyes. He expected Kael's few loyal guards to be overwhelmed, the remaining council members to fall in line out of fear. The throne was his. Just as Vorlag finished his treasonous speech, the great double doors to the throne room swung open with a resounding boom. Every head turned. A figure stood silhouetted against the light of the main hall, a figure that was both familiar and terrifyingly new. Valeria entered, clad in the dark, gleaming armor Kael had given her. The silver wolf's head, intertwined with the golden crown on her breastplate, seemed to catch and hold the light, a bold declaration of a new order. Her silver eyes, blazing with a cold, righteous fury, swept over the room, missing nothing. She was not a prisoner, not a scout. She was a warrior queen, and her presence shifted the very balance of power in the room. She did not speak. Words were unnecessary. With a fluid motion, she reached behind her and dragged a bound, gagged figure into the room, throwing him at Vorlag's feet. It was Lorcan, the merchant, his eyes wide with terror. Then, from a pouch at her belt, she produced a small, leather-bound ledger. She tossed it onto the floor in the center of the room. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. It was his secret book of accounts, the undeniable proof of his dealings with the pack's enemies. "The only traitor here," Valeria's voice rang out clear and powerful, cutting through the stunned silence, "is the one who sells his own pack for a broken crown." The tide did not just turn. It crashed down upon Vorlag with the force of a tidal wave. The undecided council members stared from the terrified merchant to the damning ledger, the truth undeniable. Vorlag's conspirators faltered, their weapons suddenly heavy in their hands, their certainty evaporating into fear. Enraged, exposed, his lifetime of plotting crumbling to dust in a single, humiliating moment, Vorlag let out a guttural roar. He lunged, but not at Kael, the king he had sought to usurp. He lunged at Valeria, the woman, the former prisoner, the architect of his downfall. He would rip the victory from her cold, dead hands, but he never reached her. Kael moved like a thunderclap, a blur of black leather and alpha fury. He intercepted Vorlag, his forearm crashing against the traitor's chest with enough force to stagger a bull. The two alphas clashed, a brutal, desperate duel of raw power against treacherous cunning. Steel rang on steel as their blades met, sparks flying in the tense, silent throne room. Kael was stronger. His rage giving him a terrifying power. But Vorlag was slippery, using every dirty trick he knew. As they fought, locked in a deadly dance, one of Vorlag's last loyalists saw an opening. He crept up behind Kael, his own sword raised to deliver a fatal blow to the king's unprotected back. Valeria, her senses honed by 1,000 nights in the wild, saw the movement out of the corner of her eye. With a scout's impossible speed, she drew the short blade from her boot and threw it. The knife flew true, embedding itself in the conspirator's throat. He choked, his eyes wide with surprise, and crumpled to the ground. The momentary distraction was all Kael needed. He hooked his leg behind Vorlag's, sending the older wolf off balance. With a powerful twist, Kael disarmed him, Vorlag's sword clattering across the stone floor. A sickening crack echoed through the hall as Kael broke his arm, ending the fight. Kael stood over the defeated, whimpering traitor, his chest heaving, his blade pressed against Vorlag's throat. Justice was his to deliver, but he did not. He looked across the room, his gaze finding Valeria's. A silent question passed between them, an acknowledgement of all they had been through, of the partnership they had forged. He was asking for her consent, not as a king to a subject, but as a partner to his equal. Valeria met his gaze, her face grim but resolute. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was not a gesture of vengeance, but of justice. It was for the warriors who died in the ambush, for the pack that had been betrayed, for the future they now had to build from the ashes of this treachery. Understanding passed between them. Kael turned his attention back to the man at his feet, and with a swift, clean motion, he delivered the king's justice. The battle for the Duskfall citadel was over. The throne room was silent, the air thick with the coppery scent of blood. The surviving conspirators, their faces pale with shock and fear, were being rounded up by Kael's loyal guards. Kael stood over Vorlag's body for a long moment, the weight of his actions settling upon him. Then he turned, his gaze sweeping past the stunned council members, past the guards, and landing on Valeria. He walked to her, ignoring everyone else in the room. He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers, and led her to the dais where the massive carved stone throne sat. He did not take the seat. Instead, he turned with her to face the stunned council. "You have seen the truth today." Kael's voice boomed, filled with an authority that no one dared question. "You saw a woman condemned, who held to her honor even in the face of death. You saw a warrior who defended her king when others who had sworn oaths of loyalty sought to strike him down. You saw a mind that outwitted a traitor and saved this pack from civil war. He lifted their joined hands. I took her as a prisoner, but she has proven herself a queen. From this day forward, she is not my shadow. She is not my consort. He looked at her, his love and respect shining in his eyes for all to see. She is my equal. Hail, Valeria, your queen. For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Then, old Gregor, his face streaked with grime and tears of relief, dropped to one knee. Hail, Queen Valeria, he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. One by one, then in a great rushing wave, the other loyal pack members knelt, their shouts echoing through the blood-stained hall, a chorus of loyalty to their new queen. Later that night, the throne room was quiet, scrubbed clean of the blood but not the memory of the day's events. Kael and Valeria stood together on a high balcony, looking out at the moonlit kingdom, their kingdom. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of victory and peace. His arm was wrapped securely around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder, the cold steel of her armor finally removed. The chains of the dungeon had not just turned to silk, they had been reforged into a crown, one she now wore not on her head, but in the hearts of her people. You once told me, she said softly, her voice a low murmur in the quiet of the night, that you swore to break me. He tightened his hold on her, his lips brushing against her hair. I was a fool, he rumbled, his voice thick with the memory of his own arrogance. A king, blinded by grief and pride. He was silent for a moment, before continuing. You said you would break my crown. Valeria looked up at him, a faint smile playing on her lips. And I did. Yes, Kael agreed, his own mouth curving into a smile as he looked down at her, his love a tangible presence between them. You did. You shattered the crown of arrogance and ignorance I wore. You broke the king I was. He gestured with his free hand out at the peaceful kingdom, at the citadel standing strong and united under the light of the full moon. And you replaced it with this, with us, something far stronger, something true. He lowered his head, and their final kiss was not one of desperate passion or the sealing of an alliance, but one of deep, abiding love and unwavering partnership. They were no longer just an alpha and his mate, a king and his prisoner. They were a king and queen, and they were ready to rule, together,